One slap in the middle of the lunch rush, and everyone at headquarters assumed it was just a petty jealous scene. "That's my husband's bottle. How dare you touch it?" the woman screamed. As I wiped my cheek, I knew my husband was not terrified of his affair coming to light. He was terrified because that water bottle was the first clue unraveling his elaborate plot to steal my company and erase my legacy from the boardroom forever. I am Harper Flores. At 36 years old, I sit as the chairwoman of the board and the sole holder of 52% of the shares in Northrail Cold Freight. My mother built this cold chain logistics empire from the ground up, starting with a single, drafty warehouse in the industrial outskirts of Dallas and a relentless will to conquer a male-dominated industry. Where others saw frozen goods, she saw the lifeblood of the nation flowing through refrigerated veins. She built a kingdom of steel, ice, and moving parts. And when she passed away, the heavy crown of that kingdom was placed firmly upon my head. Her death did not come peacefully, and the aftermath was a storm of unprecedented chaos. We were immediately hit by a global supply chain crisis that choked the ports, stalled the fleets, and threatened to shatter everything my mother had built. For 18 months, I practically lived in the executive suites. I breathed recycled air, drank bitter coffee, and fought tooth and nail to keep our contracts alive. By the time the crisis began to clear, I was a hollowed-out shell of a human being. I was utterly exhausted, both in my physical body and in my spirit, in that state of profound vulnerability. I made a decision that felt like salvation but was, in truth, the sealing of my own tomb. I appointed my husband, Mason Whitaker, to oversee Northrail's day-to-day operations as acting chief executive officer. Mason was our former chief operating officer. He possessed a silver tongue, an impeccably tailored presence, and an innate, terrifying ability to make whoever he was speaking to feel like the center of the universe. To the outside world, Mason was the perfect image of a modern chief executive officer. He is elegant and decisive, an inspiring figure who commands attention the moment he steps into a room. The leading industry magazines recently featured his portrait on their glossy covers, praising him with grandiose headlines. They called him the visionary man bringing Northrail into a glorious new era. But inside the towering, silent walls of our lakeside estate, that golden veneer has slowly peeled away, revealing a chilling rot underneath. The man who used to pour my wine and massage my aching shoulders now exists as a phantom in our marriage. His absences grew gradually, masked by the perfect excuses of corporate dedication. First, it was overnight terminal inspections that kept him away until dawn. Then, it became consecutive days of site visits and closed-door strategy retreats. He changed the security passwords on all his personal devices. He began finding reasons to avoid our evening dinners, leaving me to sit alone at one end of a mahogany table that felt miles long. Whenever I attempted to bridge the gap, asking a simple question about a routing issue or a warehouse acquisition, his jaw would tighten with visible annoyance. "Harper, you stepped back for your health. Please let me handle the stress. You need to rest." That is what he would always say. He delivered those words with a condescending sweetness that coated his irritation, treating my genuine interest in my own company as a burdensome interruption. The decay of our life together did not announce itself with a dramatic confrontation or a shattered vase. It seeped into our home through minor, irritating details that I initially tried to ignore. I noticed that the expensive, custom-engraved steel water bottle I had gifted him for his promotion stopped returning to our kitchen counter. I noticed that when I called his executive office, his junior assistants seemed to possess intimate knowledge of his private medical appointments and dietary preferences, details he had not bothered to share with his own wife. More alarmingly, the veteran employees, the fiercely loyal directors who had stood by the Flores family for decades, were quietly vanishing from the company roster. They were resigning one by one, replaced by aggressive, compliant executives loyal only to Mason. The first real crack in the glass appeared during a charity gala late last month. The ballroom was suffocatingly opulent, filled with the scent of expensive perfume and blooming orchids. I was standing near an ice sculpture, sipping my champagne, when an old acquaintance from the freight circles leaned in. His tone dripped with casual, careless gossip. "I really have to say, Harper, your new executive secretary runs quite the tight ship over at headquarters. Tessa Bell, is it? Dealing with her is like dealing with the real boss of North Rail. She certainly knows how to mark her territory." I maintained a polite, practiced smile. I nodded and smoothly changed the subject to the upcoming silent auction. But beneath my silk dress, my skin turned entirely cold. The name echoed in my mind like a funeral bell. Tessa Bell. A woman I had personally approved for a mid-level administrative role just a year ago had somehow elevated herself to the ultimate gatekeeper of my mother's legacy. She was behaving as the real boss, while the actual chairwoman was being gently managed into oblivion. The final, undeniable truth crashed down upon me 3 days ago. I was sitting in my private study, running my fingers over the leather binding of my mother's old ledger, when my secure private line rang. It was a senior executive from our primary lending bank. He sounded slightly hesitant, calling to request a routine verbal confirmation regarding a new, massive collateral package associated with North Rail. He began reading off the assets involved, listing 3 of our most vital, strategic shipping terminals. "I just need to ensure the chairwoman is fully briefed on the debt restructuring terms submitted this morning," the banker said, his voice echoing slightly over the speaker. A freezing wave of adrenaline pierced my chest, stopping my breath. I had never seen, let alone authorized, any such debt restructuring. I had not signed a single document pledging our core terminals as collateral. My name, my authority, and my family's assets were being aggressively leveraged in the dark, entirely without my knowledge. "Of course," I replied smoothly. I forced my vocal cords to remain steady, keeping my tone utterly devoid of the panic screaming in my head. "Everything is moving exactly as planned. Thank you for checking in." I hung up the phone and sat motionless in the suffocating luxury of that beautiful prison. I did not cry or throw the phone. I did not rush to headquarters demanding answers. I knew that if I confronted him too early, I would be walking straight into the story he had already written for me. I know exactly how a guilty man operates. When a traitor has already written the script of his betrayal, any direct, emotional confrontation only hands him the very weapon he needs to destroy you. If I marched in there demanding answers, he would call me paranoid. He would look at the board members with pity in his eyes and blame my mental fatigue. He would use my righteous anger as definitive proof that I was unstable and unfit to lead the company. He would use my outburst to erase his tracks faster than I could uncover them. By the end of that day, a chilling realization settled into my bones. Mason and his gatekeeper do not merely want to cheat on me. They are not satisfied with just desecrating our marriage vows in secret. They want to orchestrate a complete coup. They want to strip me of my power, steal my reputation, and erase the Flores name from the very empire my family built. They want me to be the fragile, invisible wife who quietly faded into irrelevance behind the tinted glass of her mansion. But they have made a catastrophic miscalculation. They forgot whose blood runs in my veins. They looked at my exhaustion and mistook it for weakness. They forgot that before I was a tired wife seeking peace, I was a ruthless operator who kept 52% of a logistics titan in an iron grip. I will not fight them from the outside, throwing baseless accusations at closed executive doors. I am going to step back into my own company. I will strip away the designer clothes, bury the Harper Flores name under a fabricated identity, and walk right through the front security gates as a person no one needs to remember. I am going to look with my own 2 eyes to see exactly how Mason is bleeding my empire dry, and I am going to find out exactly who is standing right beside him in the dark. Getting Lena Brooks on board had been the easiest part of this entire nightmare. Lena was our senior compliance manager, a fiercely loyal woman who owed her entire career and her daughter's college tuition to my late mother. When I called her on a secure private line and told her I needed a ghost position in the records control department for a few days, she did not ask a single question. She simply accessed the human resources database and generated a short-term contractor profile under the name Helen Foster. At 6 in the morning, I stood in front of my walk-in closet and systematically stripped away every piece of armor I usually wore. I took off my diamond earrings and left my platinum wedding band sitting on the velvet tray. I bypassed the row of tailored Italian wool suits and pulled out a stiff, inexpensive navy blazer I had bought from a discount department store the night before. I traded my custom leather heels for a pair of plain, rubber-soled flats. I tied my hair back into a severe, unremarkable knot. I left my luxury vehicle in the garage and drove a rented, gray compact car to the headquarters. Instead of pulling into the reserved underground VIP garage, I navigated to the sprawling outdoor employee parking lot. The Texas sun was already beating down on the asphalt. I walked the quarter-mile to the rear entrance, clutching a flimsy paper visitor badge that clipped awkwardly to my lapel. Passing through security was a surreal experience. The guards who usually scrambled to open the executive elevator for me did not even look up from their monitors. A young man merely scanned the barcode on my paper tag, nodded toward the turnstiles, and went back to chewing his gum. I was entirely invisible. The moment I stepped into the main atrium, the physical shock of what Mason had done hit me like a solid blow to the ribs. The soul of North Rail had been scrubbed clean. For 15 years, a massive oil-painted portrait of my mother standing in front of our very first refrigerated truck had hung directly behind the main reception desk. It was gone. I let my eyes wander and finally spotted it relocated to a dimly lit side corridor leading toward the emergency exits. In its place hung a massive, high-definition digital display. It flashed sleek, corporate graphics and a brand-new company slogan. The old motto about keeping America fed had been replaced by a sterile phrase about forward momentum and modern synergy, featuring Mason's stylized signature at the bottom. I kept my head down and made my way to the records control department on the 4th floor. As I settled into my assigned, gray fabric cubicle, I began to observe the new rhythm of my own company. The culture had mutated into something toxic. The open collaboration my mother championed was dead. Mid-level managers walked the aisles with their shoulders hunched, visibly terrified of drawing the attention of upper management. Junior assistants spoke to senior assistants in cloying, sycophantic tones, desperate for scraps of favor. The veteran employees, the ones who had built this place alongside my family, sat at their desks in deafening silence. They kept their eyes glued to their screens, typing mechanically, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Hovering over all of this fear was the invisible, suffocating shadow of Tessa Bell. Her name was whispered in the break rooms and across the cubicle walls like a threat. Through the low murmurs, I learned that she had established an absolute dictatorship over the executive floor. She did not just manage the calendar of the chief executive officer, she dictated who was granted an audience and who was banished. She controlled the flow of information. I overheard a senior logistics coordinator complaining quietly that Tessa had publicly humiliated him in the hallway the previous afternoon, sharply putting him in his place because he dared to request a direct budget approval without kissing her ring first. I turned my attention to my monitor. My temporary access granted me entry to the archived vendor contracts and recent expense logs. I started digging. Within 2 hours, my blood turned to ice. I found glaring, undeniable discrepancies buried in the operational ledgers. There were massive spikes in our yard lease agreements across the Midwest. The monthly payouts for freight brokerage fees had increased by nearly 40% over the last quarter, bleeding hundreds of thousands of dollars into external accounts. Furthermore, there was an entirely new category of commercial consulting costs. I cross-referenced the payees. They were not our standard, vetted industry partners. They were obscure, newly formed limited liability companies. The money was flowing out of North Rail like water through a cracked dam, routed directly into the hands of unknown vendors. Around 11 in the morning, I walked to the communal kitchenette to get a cup of black coffee. A junior financial analyst was standing by the sugar packets, looking exhausted. I gave him a polite, tired smile, the universal greeting of a lower-level contractor. "Rough morning," I asked mildly. He sighed heavily and rubbed the back of his neck. "You have no idea. We are in the middle of a massive power restructuring phase. the higher-ups are demanding revised forecasts by the hour. Everything is being shifted around. Restructuring. I kept my voice perfectly neutral, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. I thought the board just approved the annual budget. The analyst let out a cynical scoff. The board does whatever the top floor tells them to do right now. If you want a piece of advice as a new contractor, keep your head down and do not ask too many questions. And whatever you do not mention Harper Flores. I froze, but quickly forced myself to take another sip of coffee. The chairwoman, my. He looked around nervously, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. The word going around is that she is not doing well. Mentally. I mean, people are saying she completely cracked under the pressure of the supply chain crisis and is barely holding it together at home. The executives are quietly preparing to transition her out permanently before she blocks the new expansion deals. It is a sad situation, but Mason is stepping up to save the ship. My grip on the ceramic mug tightened until my knuckles turned white. I nodded sympathetically, excused myself, and walked back to my cubicle. The air in my lungs felt like shattered glass. They were not just stealing money, they were assassinating my character. Mason and Tessa were deliberately planting seeds of doubt throughout the entire corporate structure, carefully crafting a narrative of my mental decline. They were painting me as a hysterical, unstable woman who needed to be gently pushed out of the way for the good of the enterprise. Every rumor, every hushed conversation, was a calculated brick in the wall they were building to shut me out forever. I sat at my desk and let the cold, hard fury solidify in my chest. I did not shed a tear. The sadness was gone, replaced by a crystalline, predatory focus. By the end of my first morning, a senior records supervisor dropped a thick, red-tabbed folder onto my desk. "Helen," he said brusquely, "these are the modified operational routing files for the new East Coast corridor. They require immediate signature from the chief executive officer. Take the service elevator up to the top floor and hand them directly to the executive secretary. Do not linger." I looked at the folder. This was it. The barrier between the ghost I was pretending to be and the reality I needed to face. "Understood," I replied softly. I picked up the heavy file, smoothed the wrinkles of my cheap navy blazer, and walked toward the elevator banks. I pressed the silver button for the executive suite. As the mechanical hum of the elevator carried me upward, my pulse beat a steady, violent rhythm against my throat. The doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the plush, hushed elegance of the top floor. The first door was finally cracked open, and I was stepping right through it. The executive floor was a completely different ecosystem from the rest of the building. The air up here was aggressively filtered, scented with a faint hint of cedar and expensive leather. My cheap rubber soles sank silently into the thick, imported carpet as I navigated the familiar maze of mahogany partitions. The central administrative hub was empty, an unusual sight for late morning. I gripped the red-tabbed routing folder tight against my chest, my knuckles pale, and moved toward the heavy double oak doors of the chief executive suite. I expected to hand the files to a receptionist, but the desk outside the office was abandoned. The main door to the inner sanctum, however, was open just a fraction of an inch. A sliver of warm, golden light spilled out onto the hallway runner. I raised my hand to knock, but the sound that drifted through that narrow gap froze my knuckles in midair. It was a laugh. A low, breathy, utterly relaxed sound that belonged in a dimly lit hotel bar, not the operational center of a logistics conglomerate. "You have to admit, it is almost too easy," a woman's voice murmured. It was Tessa. The pitch of her voice had dropped an entire octave from the sharp, commanding tone I had heard her use on the lower floors. It was intimate, soaked in a casual familiarity that struck me like a physical blow. "Do not underestimate the legal hurdles," Mason replied. His voice was a low, resonant hum, vibrating with a relaxed confidence I had not heard directed at me in over 2 years. There was a faint clinking sound, like ice swirling in a crystal glass. "The corporate bylaws are ancient. Navigating them requires finesse." "Finesse?" Tessa scoffed playfully. Through the crack in the door, I could see a sliver of the room. Tessa was perching on the edge of the massive mahogany desk, her legs crossed. Please, she is a stay-at-home wife playing dress-up with an inheritance. She does not understand modern freight forwarding. She definitely does not understand financial leverage. If a company is going to grow into a multi-billion-dollar entity, you have to know who to trim from the fat. You have to know who belongs on the outside. I stopped breathing. The air in the hallway felt suddenly thin, as if the oxygen had been vacuumed out. I waited for my husband to defend me. I waited for a flicker of loyalty, a sharp reprimand, anything to prove that a decade of marriage meant more than a casual joke to his subordinate. Instead, Mason let out a soft, agreeable sigh. Her absence is the greatest asset we have right now. She has been out of the public eye for so long. It is incredibly convenient. The industry already thinks she voluntarily stepped away because she could not handle the pressure. We are just giving them the narrative they already want to believe. And the new capital deal? Tessa asked, her tone shifting from playful to sharply ambitious. We close on the new funding round by the end of the quarter, Mason said smoothly. I heard the rhythmic tapping of a pen against the desk. Once that fresh capital is injected, we initiate the issuance of the new class of preferred shares. It dilutes the voting pool entirely. Her 52% majority gets swallowed whole. The veto power she holds will be effectively broken, assuming all the authorization paperwork slides through without raising red flags. Are you sure the board will not ask for a direct statement from her? The board is comprised of cowards and opportunists, Mason stated coldly. They want the valuation to go up, as long as the numbers look good. They will not ask questions. If anyone presses the issue, we simply express our deep, personal concern for her well-being. We let everyone believe she is resting at a private retreat for health reasons. Mental exhaustion, a tragic, unavoidable breakdown. They will offer their sympathies and sign right on the dotted line. I leaned a fraction of an inch closer to the doorframe, my eyes burning. Through the narrow opening, I had a clear line of sight to the massive secondary monitor mounted on the wall behind Mason's desk. It was displaying a digital document. Even from this distance, I recognized the standard formatting of a board resolution. It was a draft authorizing the exact issuance of preferred shares they were discussing. But what made the blood freeze in my veins was the bottom of the document. There, glowing brightly on the high-definition screen, was a perfect, digitally authenticated rendering of my signature. A wave of pure, absolute cold washed over me. The betrayal I had suspected was infantile compared to the reality unfolding in that room. This was not a mundane story of a board executive sleeping with his secretary. This was a calculated, multi-million-dollar corporate coup. They were actively forging legal documents, manipulating my personal image, and systematically dismantling my ownership. They were planning to steal my company and lock me in a padded narrative of mental instability, stripping me of both my power and my dignity in one seamless motion. I should get back down to the cafeteria, Tessa said, the rustle of fabric indicating she was sliding off the desk. The catering staff is setting up the executive lunch spread, and if I do not supervise them, they will serve the wrong vintage. Wait, Mason said. There was the sound of movement. Footsteps crossing the thick carpet. Where is my personal water bottle, the steel one? I cannot find it in my gym bag. Tessa let out that same, low, breathy laugh. Relax. It is sitting on my usual table down in the executive dining area, exactly like it is every single day. Everyone knows not to touch it. Just making sure, Mason murmured. I will see you downstairs in 20 minutes. Do not be late, she purred. I did not wait to hear another syllable. I stepped backward, lifting my cheap rubber-soled shoes carefully, so they would not make a single sound against the floorboards beneath the carpet. I turned and walked away from the suite, moving with the terrifying, silent precision of a ghost. I did not drop the red folder. I did not run. I walked down the long, empty corridor, my face a carefully constructed mask of absolute blankness, but inside my mind, a massive, intricate vault was unlocking. The scattered, chaotic puzzle pieces I had been collecting over the past few weeks suddenly snapped together with violent clarity. The unexplained vendor payments, the mistress playing gatekeeper, the forged digital signatures on board resolutions, the call from the bank regarding unauthorized collateral, the whispers of my supposed mental breakdown, the upcoming capital deal designed to dilute my shares. It was a flawlessly designed trap. They had arranged all the dominoes in a perfect line, and Mason was just waiting for the right moment to push the first one over. He thought he had completely isolated me. He thought I was sitting in our silent house, staring out at the lake, completely oblivious to the fact that he was constructing a guillotine with my name carved into the blade. I reached the service elevator and pressed the down button. The metal doors slid open, and I stepped into the empty metallic box. As the elevator began its descent, the cold, numb shock finally began to recede, replaced by a burning, incandescent rage. They wanted to play a game of shadows and forged documents. They wanted to steal my empire while I was looking the other way. But I was not looking the other way anymore. I was inside the walls, and they had no idea that the woman they were planning to bury had just found the shovel. The elevator descended toward the lower floors, carrying me closer to the cafeteria, closer to the lunch rush, and closer to a steel water bottle sitting on a table like a trophy. My hands stopped shaking. The time for gathering evidence from the shadows was over. It was time to light a match. The main dining pavilion at headquarters was an architectural marvel designed to simulate an open, egalitarian workspace, yet it functioned exactly like a feudal caste system. By 12:30 in the afternoon, the cavernous room was a roaring ocean of noise. Down on the main floor, hundreds of junior staff members, logistics coordinators, and contracted workers sat crammed together at long, imitation wood tables. The air down there was thick with the smell of fried food and exhausted whispers, but suspended above this sea of workers was the executive mezzanine. It was a sleek, glass-enclosed platform overlooking the main floor like a private command deck. Up there, the lighting was softer. The tables were spaced widely apart, draped with pristine white linens, and serviced by dedicated catering staff. That was where the power sat. I stood at the bottom of the floating steel staircase with a cheap plastic tray in my hands, holding a lukewarm cup of soup and a prepackaged sandwich. I looked up through the perfectly polished glass walls. Tessa was holding court at the absolute center table. She sat there like an uncrowned queen draped in ivory silk. A tight orbit of mid-level managers surrounded her, their bodies leaning inward, desperate to catch whatever pearls of wisdom she was dropping. One vice president of routing was practically tripping over his own feet to refill her sparkling water. Another director of freight operations was laughing uproariously at a joke she had just made, his face flushed with the effort of faking amusement. She was absorbing their worship with lazy, entitled satisfaction. And there, sitting dead center on the white tablecloth, right next to her manicured hand, was the target. It was a heavy, brushed steel water bottle. I did not need to be close to recognize it. I had commissioned that exact piece from a bespoke metalworker in Chicago 7 years ago. I knew the exact depth of the engraving that spelled out Mason Whitaker. More importantly, I knew the history of the small, crescent-shaped dent near the titanium cap. We had gotten that dent on a cross-country drive through the Colorado mountains, back when our marriage was built on shared dreams instead of corporate greed. He had dropped it on a granite boulder while we were hiking. Back then, he had laughed and kissed my cheek, saying the dent gave it character. Now, it was sitting as a trophy on his mistress's lunch table. I gripped the edges of my plastic tray until the cheap material creaked under my fingers. My feet moved before my conscious mind gave the order. I bypassed the crowded rows of lower tables and began climbing the floating steel staircase. With every step I took, the ambient noise of the cafeteria seemed to dull, replaced by the heavy rhythmic thud of my own heartbeat. I reached the top of the mezzanine. The catering staff threw me confused, judgmental glances, recognizing my faded navy blazer and generic paper visitor badge. Contractors did not belong up here. I ignored them. I walked straight toward the center table, The sycophantic laughter of the managers began to die down as they noticed a stranger invading their sanctuary. Tessa finally looked up, her perfectly arched eyebrows knitting together in sharp, aristocratic annoyance. I did not give her a chance to speak. I stepped right up to the edge of the white tablecloth, planted my cheap plastic tray down with a loud, disruptive clatter, and reached out. My hand bypassed the expensive catered salads and grabbed the brushed steel bottle. The metal was cold against my palm. My thumb brushed over the familiar dent. I twisted the titanium cap, unscrewed it, and raised the rim to my lips. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the icy water. The silence that fell over the executive table was absolute. The vice president of routing stopped breathing. The director of freight operations dropped his silver fork. They stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of a low-level contractor drinking from the personal vessel of the chief executive officer. Tessa stared at me for exactly 2 seconds before her aristocratic composure shattered into violent, visceral rage. She lunged out of her chair. With a sweeping backhand motion, she struck my plastic tray. The impact sent my lukewarm soup and prepackaged sandwich flying through the air. The soup splattered across the glass partition, and the tray clattered loudly to the floor, echoing like a gunshot down into the crowded lower level of the cafeteria. Hundreds of heads snapped up. The roaring noise of the main floor vanished instantly, replaced by a deafening collective gasp. Before I could even lower the steel bottle, Tessa closed the distance between us. Her hand swung through the air in a vicious arc. The palm of her hand connected with my left cheek. It was a dry, cracking slap that echoed sharply against the acoustic ceiling panels. The sheer force of the blow snapped my head to the side, sending a flare of hot, stinging pain radiating through my jaw. "That is my husband's. You dare touch it!" she screamed. Her voice was completely unhinged, stripping away all of her corporate polish. It was the primal shriek of a woman aggressively defending stolen territory. She pointed a trembling finger with perfectly painted nails right at the bottle in my hand, her chest heaving, completely oblivious to the hundreds of eyes watching her from the floor below. The entire pavilion was frozen in a state of suspended animation. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of the woman standing furiously in front of me. Then, the heavy oak double doors leading into the mezzanine dining area burst open. Mason strode into the room. His posture was rigid, radiating the immense, impatient irritation of a powerful man who had just been interrupted during a critical moment of his day. His tailored suit jacket flared behind him as he marched toward the center table, ready to reprimand whoever was causing a scene and disrupting his meticulously ordered kingdom. "What in the world is going on here?" he barked, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. He stepped past the frozen managers. He looked at the spilled soup on the glass. He looked at Tessa, who was still trembling with adrenaline. And then, his eyes shifted to the woman holding his custom-engraved steel bottle. He saw the cheap navy blazer. He saw the severe bun. And then, he looked at my face. I watched the exact moment the confidence drained out of him. The blood drained from his face so rapidly, his skin turned the color of old ash. His broad shoulders collapsed inward. The imposing aura of the visionary chief executive officer evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, pathetic imposter staring at a ghost that had just materialized in the daylight. I slowly turned my head to face him fully. I raised the back of my free hand to the corner of my mouth. When I pulled it away, there was a bright, distinct smear of red blood on my knuckles where my teeth had bitten into the inside of my lip. I did not shout. I did not need to. In the absolute, breathless silence of the massive dining hall, my voice carried with the cold, resonant clarity of striking a crystal glass. I looked directly into Tessa's furious, confused eyes. "Strange," I said evenly, letting the words hang in the chilled air. "I also heard a vow about that husband in front of a pastor." Tessa recoiled, as if she had just been electrocuted. Her mouth fell open, her eyes darting frantically between my bleeding lip and Mason's utterly destroyed expression. The managers surrounding the table physically backed away, suddenly understanding that they were watching a disaster unfold in real time. Mason could not form a single word. His silver tongue, the weapon he had used to charm investors and manipulate the media, completely failed him. He acted entirely on blind, terrified instinct. He reached out, grabbed Tessa by the forearm with brutal force, and yanked her violently behind his own body, shielding himself more than he was protecting her. It was the cowardly reflex of a man desperately trying to contain a fire that had already engulfed the room. Down below, a murmur began. It started as a low vibration, a collective whispering among hundreds of employees passing the realization rapidly down the long tables. The rumors of a tragic, unstable wife hidden away in a mansion died in that exact second. The narrative shifted violently, rewritten by the blood on my mouth and the absolute, paralyzing fear radiating from their untouchable boss. I set the brushed steel bottle down gently onto the white tablecloth. I turned my back on both of them and walked toward the stairs. I descended the glass-enclosed steps with my spine perfectly straight, every eye in the building tracking my movements. Mason and his gatekeeper had wanted to orchestrate my ruin behind locked doors. They had wanted to execute my legacy in the dark. But as I walked out of that cafeteria, leaving a shattered silence in my wake, I knew I had just dragged their execution into the blinding light of day. I had the first spark securely in my hand, and I was entirely prepared to burn the whole structure to the ground. I did not run to my car or hide in a restroom to collect myself. Instead, I walked straight back to my assigned fabric cubicle on the 4th floor, sat down in my cheap rolling chair, and placed my hands flat on the laminate desktop. The chaotic adrenaline of the cafeteria confrontation was fading, leaving behind a cold, razor-sharp calculation in my mind. I knew exactly what Mason would do next. He would panic, and then he would try to contain the fallout. I picked up my desk phone and dialed Lena Brooks on her direct extension. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight with unspoken questions, undoubtedly having already heard the wildfire rumors spreading through the lower levels. "Lena, listen to me very carefully," I said, keeping my voice pitched at a low, steady hum. "I need you to access the security server right now. I need the raw, unedited camera feeds from the executive dining pavilion covering 12 noon to 1 o'clock this afternoon. Download the files onto an encrypted external drive immediately. Do it before the top floor IT administration issues a mandatory system purge to protect his image." "Consider it done," Lena replied without a single second of hesitation. "I am locking the file behind a compliance audit firewall right now. They will need a federal subpoena to delete it once I classify it. With the public evidence secured, I needed a map of the internal battlefield." Through Lena, I quietly arranged a secure channel with Martin Keene. Martin was a veteran labor relations consultant who had worked alongside my mother for 2 decades. He possessed a mind like a steel trap and a deep, abiding hatred for the arrogant corporate culture Mason had cultivated. We communicated through encrypted messages, and Martin laid out the invisible power network my husband had constructed. He explained how Mason had systematically forced early retirements on the old guard, replacing them with compliant, highly paid yes-men who cared more about their stock options than fiduciary duty. But more importantly, Martin pointed me toward the darkest corners of the vendor ledgers. I spent the next 4 hours buried in the logistics data and payment reconciliation files. My eyes scanned hundreds of lines of alphanumeric codes, looking for the poison I knew had to be there. I found the first fatal bleed in the freight brokerage accounts. Over the past 8 months, Northrail had begun routing an exorbitant amount of overflow shipping volume through a newly contracted third-party logistics provider called Bell Transit Advisory. The invoices were staggering. We were paying them a premium of nearly 15% above the standard market rate for routing services we could easily handle in-house. I ran a background trace on the corporate registry for Bell Transit Advisory. It was registered to a residential address in a wealthy suburb of Houston. The principal managing partner listed on the incorporation documents was an arrogant, underqualified man I had briefly met at a company holiday party 3 years ago. It was Tessa's older brother. The realization tasted like copper in my mouth. My husband was not just buying his mistress expensive dinners. He was actively embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from my company to enrich her family, disguising the theft as legitimate commercial consulting fees. I dug deeper, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I bypassed the standard contractor permissions using backdoor access codes my mother had built into the original mainframe. I needed to understand how Mason was authorizing these massive external contracts without triggering an automatic board review. The answer was buried in the digital signature logs. I pulled up the archived minutes from 3 separate emergency board meetings held over the last 6 months. According to the official corporate record, I had been virtually present and had cast the deciding vote to approve the expanded discretionary budget for the chief executive officer. My encrypted digital signature was stamped perfectly at the bottom of every single resolution. I opened my personal calendar on my phone and cross-referenced the dates. A cold, lethal calm washed over me. On the evening of the 14th of October, when the first crucial vendor expansion was allegedly signed in the Dallas boardroom, I was physically standing on a stage at a philanthropic gala in Chicago, delivering a keynote address on sustainable supply chains. The notary log attached to the board resolution claimed a local Dallas notary had witnessed my signature at 8 o'clock that night. It was mathematically and physically impossible. They had stolen my digital token and bribed or coerced a notary public into validating a blatant forgery. This was no longer just a breach of trust. This was felony corporate fraud. But Mason was a man who worshipped his own ambition. He would not commit federal crimes just to pay off his mistress. There had to be a larger endgame. I shifted my focus from the expenditure reports to the revenue forecasts and the investor relations portal. I opened the master presentation deck that Mason and his executive team were preparing for the upcoming capital injection from Blackridge Capital. As I read through the slides, the sheer scale of the deception took my breath away. Mason had artificially inflated our fleet utilization metrics. He was logging empty trailers moving between terminals as active, billable shipments, padding the daily volume by at least 20%. He had also manipulated the customer retention formulas, burying lost contracts under layers of projected future revenues. He was systematically pumping the company with synthetic air, driving the valuations sky high just before the investors brought their money to the table. And then, on slide 42, I found the silver bullet. It was a densely worded, seemingly innocuous slide titled Governance Transition Scenario. In the fine print, outlining the risk management protocols for the new investors, there was a detailed contingency plan. It outlined a scenario where the current chairwoman would enact a temporary withdrawal from all fiduciary duties due to prolonged, private health complications. The slide assured the investors that the chief executive officer would assume absolute unilateral control of the board to ensure market stability during her tragic but peaceful departure. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing monitor. The fluorescent lights of the records department hummed above me. Everything suddenly made perfect, horrific sense. They were playing a simultaneous game across 2 entirely different boards. The romantic betrayal, the gaslighting, the rumors of my mental collapse that was the social board, designed to humiliate me and isolate me from my allies. But the forged signatures, the inflated routing numbers, and the secret collateral packages that was the financial board, designed to legally amputate me from my own empire before I even knew I was bleeding. They thought they had me trapped in a beautifully constructed cage of my own alleged insanity. They thought I would quietly fade away, too embarrassed and exhausted to fight back. I closed the investor presentation and began downloading every single piece of evidence onto a secure, encrypted flash drive. The routing logs, the fake notary stamps, the Bell Transit invoices, and the manipulated valuation models. I did not want to merely fire my husband or sue him for divorce. I wanted to completely annihilate him. I wanted to tear down the false kingdom he had built on my back and salt the earth so nothing he planted would ever grow again. I began to formulate a precise, 3-tier strategy in the dark of my cubicle. Tier 1 would be the preservation of the raw, undeniable public spectacle. I would hold on to the cafeteria security footage as a devastating character weapon. Tier 2 would be the invisible legal blockade. I would use the forged notary logs to freeze his ability to move assets, trapping him in a financial paralyzation he could not explain to his new partners. And Tier 3 would be the execution. I would not confront him in our home. I would not send a lawyer to his office. I was going to wait for the exact moment he felt the most powerful. I was going to let him gather the wealthiest investors, the most important board members, and the most influential bankers in one room. I would let him raise the glass to toast his ultimate victory. And then, I was going to force the absolute, unvarnished truth to detonate right in his face. The air in the fourth-floor records department grew unbearably thick by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I sat completely still in my assigned fabric cubicle, staring at the gray laminate desktop, listening to the frantic energy vibrating through the headquarters. I was no longer an invisible ghost haunting the periphery of my own empire. I had become the most actively hunted target inside the building. A heavily encrypted message from Lena flashed across my temporary monitor. The fallout from the cafeteria had been instantaneous and severe. Tessa had stormed straight into the Human Resources Department, her face still flushed with rage, and filed a formal high-priority grievance. She officially accused the unidentified female contractor of malicious harassment, attempted destruction of executive property, and inciting a dangerous workplace disruption. But it was Mason's reaction that truly set the building on edge. He was in an absolute panic, driven by the terrifying realization that I was physically inside the perimeter. He immediately ordered the Information Technology Department to initiate a massive, silent sweep. They were running cross-references on every single temporary security badge issued over the last 48 hours. They were pulling the digital logs from the elevator banks and scrubbing the hallway camera feeds, desperately trying to trace my physical movements and match my face to whatever alias I was hiding behind. Every time a security guard walked past my aisle, my spine went entirely rigid. I was trapped in a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, forced to navigate the shadows of the very fortress my family had constructed. Just before 3 o'clock, a shadow fell across the entrance to my workspace. I looked up to see Lena standing there, and right behind her was the Senior Director of Human Resources. The woman looked as though she was about to collapse from sheer terror. Her face was ashen, and her hands were trembling violently. Lena had cornered her in an empty stairwell minutes earlier, dropping my real name and demanding absolute compliance. The director did not speak. She simply slid a thick, unmarked manila envelope across my desk and took a step back, her eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. I opened the envelope. Inside was a physical printed dossier that Mason had kept entirely off the official corporate servers. It was a deeply disturbing, meticulously fabricated psychological hit piece. Mason had spent the last 8 months quietly building a comprehensive soft file documenting my supposed mental collapse. He had taken the dates of the private grief counseling sessions I attended after my mother passed away and twisted them into official records of severe psychiatric instability. He had cataloged the days I stayed home with a migraine as crippling depressive episodes. He even included statements from anonymous junior staff members, carefully coerced into mentioning how erratic and withdrawn the chairwoman had become. It was a masterpiece of corporate gaslighting, designed to legally prove that I was completely detached from reality and a danger to the enterprise. But the dossier was merely the foundation for a much darker legal maneuver. As I flipped to the final section of the file, the true brilliance of his betrayal brought a sickening chill to my skin. Buried deep within the legal addendums of our original marital trust agreement, a document drafted over a decade ago, was a specific fail-safe. My mother had insisted on an emergency medical proxy clause. It stated that in the event of my temporary medical incapacitation, my husband would be granted full, unilateral power of attorney to cast my 52% voting rights on all corporate matters. It was designed to protect the company if I were ever in a coma or physically unable to govern. Mason was weaponizing that exact clause. He was using the fabricated psychological dossier to declare an emergency medical situation. But activating that proxy legally required a sworn, notarized affidavit of consent from me, acknowledging my own unfitness. I stared at the final page. There it was. A perfectly forged, digitally stamped affidavit bearing my signature, handing him the keys to the entire kingdom. He had bypassed the board of directors entirely by manufacturing my legal consent to my own corporate execution. I checked the internal executive calendar through my backdoor access. The timeline for his coup was terrifyingly short. The guillotine was scheduled to drop on Friday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. Mason had organized an opulent, highly publicized signing ceremony in the main executive boardroom with the senior partners of Blackridge Capital. That was the exact moment the new issuance of preferred shares would go live. Once those papers were signed, my majority ownership would be instantly diluted down to a meaningless minority stake. I would lose my veto power, my board seat, and my control over North Rail forever. I needed to see the underlying terms of the Blackridge deal, bypassing the security sweeps on the server. I dug into the encrypted debt appendix attached to the final term sheet. When the document loaded on my screen, I actually stopped breathing. I sat frozen, staring at the catastrophic risk he had taken without my knowledge. In order to secure the massive influx of capital from the private equity firm, Mason had collateralized our three most strategic freight terminals. He had quietly pledged the massive routing hubs in Memphis, Atlanta, and Chicago as direct assets against the new debt. These were the crown jewels of our logistics network, the very beating heart of our supply chain. He had put them on the chopping block without a single legitimate board vote. If the market dipped even slightly, or if the new expansion failed to hit its aggressive targets, Blackridge Capital would have the legal right to seize those properties. North Rail would be fundamentally crippled overnight. He was entirely willing to risk destroying the company just to pry it from my hands, as if the financial treason was not enough. The final insult was waiting at the very bottom of the Compensation Committee's draft approvals. I found a confidential bonus letter, signed by Mason, and ready to be executed the moment the capital deal closed. If the Blackridge transaction was successful, Tessa Bell was not just receiving a quiet cash payout for her role in the deception. She was guaranteed an immediate public promotion to the title of Regional Vice President of Operations. Furthermore, the company was authorizing a long-term corporate lease for a luxury penthouse in the downtown Arts District, with the exorbitant monthly rent funneled quietly through one of the obscure shell affiliates I had discovered earlier. He was using my family's money to buy his mistress a corporate kingdom and a sky-high palace. I sat in the dim fluorescent light of the cubicle, listening to the low hum of the servers and the distant footsteps of security guards patrolling the aisles. The sick, hollow feeling of a broken heart was entirely gone. Any lingering grief over my ruined marriage evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. This was no longer a domestic tragedy about a cheating husband. That personal pain felt incredibly small right now. This was a hostile takeover wrapped in elegant financial jargon. It was a multi-million-dollar heist designed to strip me of my wealth, my sanity, and my mother's legacy. Mason thought he held all the cards. He thought he had successfully cornered a frightened, unstable woman inside her own territory. He had no idea that by hunting me inside these walls, he had given me exactly what I needed to burn his Friday morning ceremony to ashes. I drove back to our lakefront estate just as the sun began to dip below the waterline. It was barely past 6 o'clock in the evening. I wanted to be standing in the center of his sanctuary long before he had the luxury of rehearsing a plausible lie or consulting with his crisis management team. The massive stone house was entirely empty. The domestic staff had been dismissed for the day, leaving behind a suffocating, immaculate silence. Every step I took across the imported hardwood foyer echoed upward into the vaulted ceiling, sounding exactly like a slow, rhythmic knocking on the lid of a heavy wooden coffin. I did not walk into the house crying, and I did not intend to start a screaming match about his infidelity. I walked straight into the formal dining room. I bypassed the light switches, allowing the fading twilight to cast long, sharp shadows across the expansive mahogany table. I reached into my leather tote bag and extracted the physical copies I had printed from the encrypted server drive. I laid them out with meticulous precision on the polished wood, On the left, the forged board resolution authorizing the new class of preferred shares. On the right, the debt appendix pledging the 3 primary freight terminals to the private equity firm. I sat at the head of the table in the semi-darkness and waited. I heard the heavy grind of his vehicle's tires on the gravel driveway at exactly 6:45. The heavy oak front door opened and closed with a dull thud. His footsteps were hurried, heavy, and erratic as he moved through the hallway. He was frantically looking for me. When he stepped into the dining room archway and saw me sitting completely still in the shadows, he stopped dead in his tracks. For a fraction of a second, genuine terror flashed across his face. But Mason was a master of corporate theater. He quickly rearranged his features into a mask of deep, patronizing concern. "Harper," he breathed out, stepping into the room with his hands raised slightly, playing the role of the apologetic, desperate husband. "My God, the Human Resources Department called me. The security team said you just walked out of the building. What were you doing dressing up like that and hiding on the 4th floor? You are clearly unwell. The stress has finally broken you. We need to get you back to the private clinic immediately." I did not raise my voice. I did not move from my chair. I simply tapped my index finger twice against the stack of papers resting on the mahogany table. "Have a seat, Mason." He hesitated, then slowly walked toward the table. His eyes dropped to the documents. Even in the dim light, he instantly recognized the highly confidential formatting of the Blackridge Capital Debt Appendix. The color drained from his face all over again. He realized in that exact moment that the flimsy jealousy cover story was dead. I had skipped the personal confrontation and gone straight for the evidence. "Harper, you are looking at preliminary, highly classified drafts," he started, his voice slipping into the smooth, persuasive cadence he used to calm nervous shareholders. "You are misunderstanding the context. This is highly complex, flexible financing. It is designed entirely to protect the company's liquidity. The logistics market is incredibly volatile right now. I had to make rapid executive decisions to shield your assets from the upcoming downturn." "And the woman in the cafeteria?" I asked, my voice as cold and flat as a sheet of winter ice. Mason waved his hand dismissively, trying to shrink the massive betrayal into a minor human resources issue. "Tessa is an overzealous assistant who severely overstepped her boundaries today. She took her administrative authority too far. I have already instructed legal to draft her termination papers. You have my word." "She did not sound like an assistant," I replied, leaning forward slightly so the shadows fell away from my face. "When she slapped me across the jaw in front of half the company, she pointed at your custom steel bottle and screamed, 'That is my husband's. You dare touch it.'" The air in the dining room turned instantly toxic. Hearing that exact, humiliating phrase repeated back to him flipped a hidden switch inside Mason's mind. The apologetic, concerned husband vanished completely, replaced by the ruthless corporate usurper who had been running my empire in the dark. His posture straightened. The faux sympathy bled out of his eyes, leaving behind a cold, arrogant glare. "You want to talk about reality?" Mason scoffed, his voice dropping an octave into a harsh, mocking tone. "Let us talk about reality. Harper, you are a ghost. You are a public relations liability. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to secure hundreds of millions of dollars in fresh capital when the primary shareholder is a fragile, unstable woman who has not shown her face in the boardroom in 2 years?" He began to pace the length of the table, his hubris fully taking over. The institutional investors do not want to tie their money to a crumbling heiress. The era of the silent, generational heir coasting on family glory is completely over. A wife who retreated to her lakeside mansion to hide from the supply chain crisis cannot suddenly demand to return and take the wheel as if the world stopped spinning just for her. The market requires aggressive, stable leadership. I gave them that leadership. I let him talk. I sat perfectly still and let the suffocating silence draw the poison straight out of his mouth. Deep inside the inner pocket of my tailored blazer, a high-fidelity micro-recorder was quietly humming, capturing every single arrogant syllable echoing off the dining room walls. So you forge my digital signature on an emergency proxy and tell the board of directors I am mentally incompetent, I asked softly, carefully baiting the trap. It is the path of absolute least resistance, Mason admitted, his voice hardening with cold, undeniable pragmatism. The transaction structure will pass through the voting committee so much easier if everyone simply believes you are no longer stable enough to object. It is a mercy, really. You could not handle the pressure then, and you certainly cannot handle it now. He stopped pacing and leaned his hands heavily on the edge of the mahogany table, looming over me with a victorious smirk. Listen to me very carefully. Once Friday is finished, the Blackridge Capital clears the escrow accounts. You will still be incredibly wealthy. Harper, you will be richer on paper than you ever were. You can buy 10 more lake houses, but the actual power, the voting control, the operational authority, that will all remain securely in my hands where it belongs. You get to keep the luxurious lifestyle. I get to keep the empire breathing. It is a win for everyone. He stood up straight, waiting for my reaction. He was waiting for the hysterical breakdown he had documented in his fake psychological files. He expected me to cry, to scream, to sweep the forged documents off the table, or to throw one of the expensive crystal vases against the stone fireplace. I did none of those things. I simply reached forward and gathered the documents back into a neat stack. I stood up from the heavy wooden chair. I looked directly into his eyes for a long, agonizing minute, letting him feel the absolute, terrifying zero of my composure. Then Friday will be the day someone disappears from North Rail, I said quietly. I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on him and walked out of the formal dining room. My footsteps perfectly measured, I walked out the heavy oak front door, descended the stone steps, and got into my car. The moment the engine started, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the micro-recorder. I connected it to the secure terminal on my laptop. Within 3 minutes, the raw, unedited audio file of his complete confession was safely encrypted. I attached the file to 3 separate, highly secure messages. The first went to Naomi Sloan, the most vicious corporate litigation attorney in the state of Texas. The second went to Walter Quinn, the oldest, most fiercely independent member of the North Rail Board of Directors. The third went directly to the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at our primary lending bank. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, the city of Dallas was pitch black, a silent grid of glass and concrete. I sat inside a soundproof, climate-controlled conference room on the 42nd floor of a downtown legal high-rise. The polished granite table was cold under my forearms. Across from me sat Naomi Sloan, the most lethal corporate litigation attorney in the state of Texas. To my right sat Walter Quinn, the oldest and most fiercely independent member of the North Rail Board of Directors. Walter had served my mother since the company possessed fewer than 50 trucks. His loyalty was strictly to the iron, the asphalt, and the Flores bloodline, not the man currently occupying the chief executive suite. Naomi did not offer me a glass of water or a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. She operated entirely on tactical destruction. She spent the first hour dissecting the physical copies of the forged documents I had brought from my dining room. By 5:15 in the morning, she had already drafted an emergency ex parte injunction. I am filing this the absolute second the courthouse doors open, Naomi stated, her voice sharp, clinical, and devoid of any emotion. This order immediately and legally freezes any capital transaction, stock issuance, or asset transfer relying on your disputed electronic authorization. I am also submitting a sweeping, federally backed preservation demand for all internal corporate servers. If your husband or his loyalists try to wipe a single kilobyte of data or shred a single physical memo after 8 o'clock today, they will not just be facing civil penalties. They will be actively committing federal obstruction of justice. Walter adjusted his reading glasses, staring at the printed collateral appendix that pledged our 3 largest terminals to the private equity firm. His expression was a mask of cold, concentrated fury. He was a man who had survived 3 catastrophic market crashes by strictly adhering to institutional risk management. A major lending bank will often turn a blind eye to an arrogant executive sleeping with his secretary, Walter murmured, picking up his heavily encrypted mobile phone. They will categorize a messy public divorce as a regrettable personal distraction, but deliberately hiding a high-risk, unauthorized collateral package on primary freight hubs, falsifying the risk profile of a multi-million-dollar enterprise right before a capital injection. That is absolute financial treason. The debt covenants are completely violated. Walter looked up, his eyes locking onto mine with ruthless clarity. I am making 2 calls right now to the senior risk officers at our lead syndication partners. By the time Mason wakes up and puts on his expensive tie, his operational credit lines will be quietly, invisibly bleeding out. They will smile at him, but their hands will already be securely wrapped around his throat. The heavy oak door to the conference room opened, and Naomi's lead digital forensics investigator walked in. He was a silent, intensely focused man carrying a hardened, military-grade laptop. He connected his device to the room's projection screen and placed a bound dossier on the granite table. The results of his overnight trace were absolute and damning. He had analyzed the digital signature logs I had extracted from the 4th-floor records department. The authentication token for your signature was not breached remotely, the investigator explained, pointing a laser at the complex string of code on the screen. There was no outside hack. The Internet protocol address that validated the board resolutions pings directly back to a secure, hardwired terminal on the executive floor. Specifically, it correlates to the local area network node located entirely inside Mason Whitaker's private office. Someone physically sat in his leather chair, logged into his secured network, and deployed your stolen digital credentials. Our legal arsenal was growing exponentially with every passing hour. Shortly after 6 o'clock, my encrypted messaging application chimed. It was Martin Keene. He had spent the entire night utilizing his vast network of union representatives and warehouse contacts to track down a mid-level route logistics specialist. This particular young employee had been directly threatened by upper management just 3 weeks ago. He had been explicitly ordered to artificially inflate the cargo utilization metrics for the Black Ridge Capital pitch deck. Martin had cornered the young man in a diner parking lot at 2 a.m. and secured a sworn, notarized affidavit. The document detailed the exact dates, the specific inflated tonnage numbers, and the direct executive orders compelling him to cook the books. But the fatal blow, the absolute, inescapable checkmate, came from Lena Brooks just before sunrise. Lena called the secure conference line, her voice crackling over the speakerphone. She was not trembling with fear. She was vibrating with the sheer thrill of an archaeological discovery. She had spent the darkest hours of the night physically digging through the archived, fireproof basement safes at headquarters, completely bypassing the modernized digital servers that Mason controlled. She had found the original, typewritten founding charter my mother had drafted over 3 decades ago. Mason is a brilliant operational tactician, but he possesses zero respect for history, Lena said, the sound of rustling paper echoing through the line. He relied entirely on the modernized digital summaries of our corporate bylaws. He completely ignored the dusty, foundational paper trail. There is a buried fail-safe in the original documentation. Section 4, Paragraph 9 of the Family Trust Amendments. Read it, Naomi commanded, her pen hovering over a fresh legal pad. Your mother was paranoid about hostile takeovers and internal coups, Lena continued. The clause explicitly states that any massive structural change to the company, specifically any action resulting in the dilution of the primary shareholder voting bloc, cannot be executed solely by the board of directors. It requires the physical, notarized countersignature of a designated trust protector. Mason had completely missed it. He thought forging my medical proxy and manufacturing my psychological instability was enough to bypass the board and push the deal through. He had no idea he needed a second, entirely separate key to turn the lock on the Flores family trust. And who exactly holds the title of trust protector? Walter asked, leaning forward in his chair. I smiled for the very first time in 48 hours. It was a cold, razor-sharp expression. My mother's younger sister, I answered quietly. My aunt, Elena Flores. She retired to an isolated adobe ranch in Santa Fe over 10 years ago. Mason thinks she is just an eccentric old woman painting desert landscapes and raising horses. He has not spoken her name or considered her existence in half a decade. I had not wasted a single second after Lena gave me the information. Before I even drove to this legal high-rise, I had chartered a private twin-engine jet out of a small regional airstrip. By midnight, my personal security detail had arrived at Elena's ranch. My aunt did not need a lengthy explanation or any convincing. The moment she heard what my husband was trying to do to her late sister's legacy, she packed a single leather overnight bag and marched onto the aircraft. Now, at 7 in the morning, the heavy wooden door of the conference room swung open once more. Elena Flores walked in. She wore a heavy woven shawl and smelled faintly of sagebrush, but her eyes possessed the exact same dark, uncompromising iron that my mother used to terrify rival executives. She did not bother with pleasantries. She walked straight to the table. Naomi slid a freshly drafted, heavily binding legal document across the polished granite. It was a formal, irrevocable declaration from the official trust protector. The document absolutely nullified any and all temporary proxies, medical or otherwise, that Mason was attempting to invoke. It legally barred the issuance of any preferred shares without Elena's explicit physical presence and signature. Elena picked up a heavy brass pen. She did not even read the fine print. She simply signed her name at the bottom of the page with aggressive, sweeping strokes that practically tore the heavy cardstock. "Let him try to steal my sister's company now," Elena said. Dropping the pen onto the table with a loud clatter, I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The morning sun was finally beginning to crest over the Dallas skyline, casting long, brilliant rays of light across the glass and steel towers of the financial district. Somewhere out there, my husband was waking up in an empty mansion. He was likely practicing his confident smile in the mirror, rehearsing the smooth, persuasive lies he would tell the private equity partners tomorrow. He truly believed he had outsmarted a fragile, broken woman, but the woman looking back at me in the reflection of the window had entirely shed the skin of a grieving, betrayed spouse. I was no longer wandering in the dark, desperately trying to gather the shattered pieces of my ruined marriage. I had spent the entire night carefully constructing a flawless, inescapable legal execution block. The trap was meticulously set. The digital evidence was locked away. The banking syndicates were primed to pull the plug, and the executioners were all sitting right behind me in this room. All I had to do now was wait for the Friday morning signing ceremony. I was going to sit back and watch my arrogant husband step confidently, blindly, onto the exact trapdoor he had spent the last year building for himself. The transformation of the headquarters on Friday morning was a masterclass in corporate theater. By 8:30, the primary executive boardroom had been completely stripped of its usual sterile, functional atmosphere and reborn as a glittering stage for my husband's ultimate victory. A massive, custom-printed media backdrop dominated the far wall, displaying the Northrail logo intertwined with the Black Ridge Capitol crest. Along the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Dallas skyline, an extravagant breakfast buffet had been arranged. Waitstaff in crisp white uniforms circulated silently among the early arrivals, carrying silver trays lined with crystal flutes of chilled vintage champagne, ready to be poured the exact second the ink dried on the contracts. Heavy, embossed name cards marked the seating arrangements for the 50 incoming VIPs. Tessa drifted through the gathering crowd like a bride at a royal wedding. She had chosen a sharply tailored ivory silk suit for the occasion, a blatant sartorial declaration of her anticipated ascension. Pinned to her lapel, completely ignoring all security protocols, was a gold-rimmed Level 9 access badge. It was a tier of clearance reserved strictly for executive directors, light years above her actual administrative title. She smiled tightly at the mid-level managers, accepting their premature congratulations with a practiced, aristocratic nod. The atmosphere in the room was buoyant, fueled by a carefully planted internal memo that had conveniently leaked to the staff just an hour prior. The message vaguely but enthusiastically promised the announcement of a brilliant new governance era immediately following the capital injection. The Whisper network had already done the rest of the heavy lifting. The employees milling about the outer corridors firmly believed that today was the day I officially, voluntarily surrendered my crown. At precisely 9 o'clock, Mason stepped up to the acrylic podium at the head of the massive mahogany table. The ambient chatter dissolved into an eager, expectant silence. He adjusted his tailored jacket, flashing a brilliant, perfectly calibrated smile at the private equity partners seated in the front row. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the future of freight," Mason began, his voice resonating with an intoxicating blend of authority and warmth. He launched into his presentation, and it was a flawless performance. He did not use notes. He paced the front of the room with the dynamic energy of a visionary tech founder, projecting massive, high-definition graphics onto the digital display behind him. He boasted about a 25% increase in fleet expansion over the last 4 quarters. He highlighted the aggressively optimized profit margins and painted a picture of absolute, unshakable operational stability under his direct stewardship. He was selling them an empire operating at peak efficiency, and the men in the expensive suits were nodding in absolute agreement, eager to buy their slice. Then, the screen transitioned to a new slide. The background shifted from stark corporate blue to a soft, muted gray. A professionally taken, highly flattering photograph of me appeared on the screen. Mason lowered his voice, injecting his tone with a heavy, practiced dose of solemn empathy. "As we look toward this incredible expansion, it is also my duty to address the structure of our leadership," he said, placing a hand flat against his chest. "As many of you know, my wife, Harper Flores, has been the heart of this company for many years. However, the unprecedented strain of the recent supply chain crisis took a severe toll. Harper has chosen to temporarily withdraw to a private setting to focus entirely on her personal health and well-being. She is resting comfortably, and she fully enthusiastically supports this restructuring plan. We are moving forward today not just for the market, but to honor the legacy her family built, while she takes the time she desperately needs." It was a beautifully packaged, incredibly toxic lie. He painted my corporate execution as an act of profound mercy. The investors murmured in sympathetic understanding, utterly captivated by the narrative of the tragic heiress and the strong, capable husband stepping up to carry the burden. Less than 40 feet away, separated by a soundproof, frosted glass partition, I sat perfectly still in a small adjacent holding room. The contrast between the blindingly bright, celebratory boardroom and our cramped, suffocatingly tense space was absolute. Naomi Sloan sat to my right, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the live audio feed relaying Mason's speech. Walter Quinn sat on my left, his hands resting on the polished handle of his walking cane, his face carved from stone. Aunt Elena occupied the corner chair, her arms crossed tightly over her woven shawl, radiating a cold desert fury. Sitting directly across the small circular table from us was the senior legal counsel representing the primary lending syndicate. Between us sat a stack of sealed, heavily guarded manila folders. We had every single piece of evidence primed and ready to detonate: the forged digital signatures, the inflated route metrics, the hidden collateral transfers, and the sworn affidavits. But I had explicitly forbidden Naomi from storming the boardroom the moment Mason started speaking. I did not want to merely interrupt him. I wanted to let him spin the story, tighten every thread, and lock himself inside the consequences of his own making. I wanted him to deliver his lies flawlessly to the exact room of powerful, unforgiving men he was so desperate to impress. I needed him to reach the absolute precipice of his victory, the exact moment his pen hovered over the final signature line, before I pulled the floor out from under him. "He is wrapping up the forward projections," Naomi whispered, her eyes tracking the timestamps on the digital agenda. "They are signaling for the binders." Through the audio feed, we heard the shuffle of heavy leather-bound portfolios being distributed across the main boardroom table. The soft clinking of champagne glasses being arranged on silver trays echoed in the background. "Gentlemen, If you will direct your attention to page 42 of the master agreement, Mason said, his voice brimming with barely contained triumph, we can finalize the equity transfer and open the champagne. Suddenly, the smooth, rehearsed flow of the ceremony hit a jarring obstacle. Excuse me, Mason, we need to pause for just a moment. The voice belonged to the lead underwriter for Blackridge Capital. Through the glass, I could see the silhouette of the man holding up a hand, his other hand aggressively scrolling through a message on his encrypted mobile phone. It was the direct result of Walter's quiet phone calls the previous morning. My risk management team just flagged an anomaly in the secondary asset registry, the underwriter continued, his tone shifting from collegial to strictly professional. We need to verify the final risk appendix regarding the Memphis and Atlanta hubs before we execute any binding signatures. It will only take a few minutes to clear up. A heavy, uncomfortable silence descended upon the boardroom. The celebratory atmosphere instantly curdled. Mason let out a smooth, practiced chuckle, but I could hear the microscopic tremor of panic vibrating beneath it. He was slightly startled, but his arrogance shielded him from the true danger. He still firmly believed he was the smartest man in the room. Of course, take all the time you need, Mason replied smoothly. I assure you, our physical assets are completely unencumbered and fully aligned with the projections in your binders. There is absolutely nothing to worry about. We have operated with total transparency. I stood up from my chair in the small holding room. The heavy fabric of my charcoal suit rustled in the quiet space. He had just spoken the magic words, total transparency. He had publicly staked his reputation and the entire deal on a foundation of absolute lies, right in front of the people who held the purse strings. There was no more rope left for him to pull. The stage was perfectly set. The audience was captive. The financial trap was fully armed. All that remained was the final, devastating reveal. The only thing missing from his flawless, glittering corporate theater was the woman he had tried to bury alive. I looked at Naomi. I looked at Walter and Elena. I gave them a single, definitive nod. I reached for the brass handle of the frosted glass door, feeling the cold metal against my palm. The time for hiding in the shadows was permanently over. It was the exact moment of no return. The heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom did not just open. They swung wide with a forceful, echoing thud that made every head in the room snap toward the entrance. Mason had his gold fountain pen hovering mere inches above the signature line of the master agreement. He froze. I stepped over the threshold, leaving the suffocating holding room behind forever. I was no longer the invisible, exhausted wife hiding in a lakeside mansion. Nor was I the nameless contractor in a cheap navy blazer. I wore a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal suit. My posture was absolute iron. I was Harper Flores, the chairwoman of the board, and the sole owner of 52% of North Rail Cold Freight. The blood drained from Mason's face so fast, he looked like a corpse standing at the head of the mahogany table. Tessa, standing near the catered buffet in her ivory silk suit, dropped a crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the hardwood floor, a sharp, violent sound that perfectly matched the destruction of their flawless corporate theater. I walked the length of the room. The senior partners from Blackridge Capital and the lending syndicate stared at me in profound confusion. I reached the center of the table and placed a single, sealed manila folder down on the polished wood. On the very top of the stack, I laid down an 8x10, high-definition photograph. It was a close-up of my face, taken just hours after the incident in the cafeteria, clearly showing the angry, raised red welt of a handprint across my left cheek. A collective intake of breath swept through the investors. The tragic, peaceful narrative of my private health retreat instantly disintegrated into thin air. Before Mason could even force his paralyzed jaw to form a single word, Naomi Sloan stepped into the room, flanking my right side like a heavily armed guard. "Gentlemen," Naomi announced, her voice slicing through the tense silence, "I am the senior litigation counsel representing Harper Flores. I am officially serving notice of an emergency ex parte injunction, granted at 8 o'clock this morning by a federal judge. This order immediately halts all capital transactions, stock issuances, and asset transfers currently on this table. Furthermore, we are formally disputing the legal validity of every single document bearing my client's electronic signature over the past 8 months. The lead underwriter for Black Ridge Capital immediately pushed his leather-bound portfolio away as if it had suddenly caught fire. Disputing the signatures, Mason. What exactly is going on here? It is a misunderstanding, Mason stammered, his voice cracking, the polished chief executive completely vanishing. My wife is unwell. She does not know what she is saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, I replied evenly. I signaled toward the door. Our digital forensics investigator walked in, handing a printed packet directly to the lead underwriter. That is the undeniable proof of corporate fraud, I stated calmly to the investors. Those logs confirm my encrypted digital signature was deployed from the local area network inside my husband's private office to authorize this very capital raise, on a night when I was physically delivering a keynote address in a different state. Mason gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles completely white. I have a medical proxy. The board approved the transition. The board approved nothing but a stack of lies, Walter Quinn boomed, stepping into the room with his heavy cane striking the floorboards. Right beside him walked my aunt, Elena Flores. Walter looked directly at the other board members present. Mason relied on a manufactured psychological dossier to trigger a temporary proxy, but he forgot to read the founding charter of the company he was trying to steal. Elena stepped forward, her dark eyes pinning Mason to the wall. Any structural change diluting the voting block of the Flores Family Trust requires the explicit, notarized approval of the trust protector. I hold that title. I have never approved a single action taken by this man, and I hereby declare every proxy he holds entirely null and void. The investors were already whispering frantically to their respective legal teams. The deal was dead, but I was not finished. I wanted the complete annihilation of the false image he had sold them. I pulled a small remote from my pocket and pressed a button, routing the audio from my micro-recorder directly through the boardroom's state-of-the-art presentation speakers. The sound of a brutal, cracking slap echoed through the room, followed immediately by Tessa's unhinged, screaming voice. "That is my husband's! You dare touch it!" Then came the dead, panicked silence from Mason. The investors turned to look at Tessa, who was now trembling violently against the glass windows, the color completely washed from her face. The illusion of the dignified chief executive officer and his professional administrative secretary shattered into a million filthy, irredeemable pieces right before their eyes. But the romantic betrayal is just the appetizer, I said, leaning forward and resting my hands on the mahogany table. Let us talk about the financial treason. I systematically laid out the remaining documents. I dropped the sworn affidavit from the route logistics specialist, exposing the artificially inflated fleet metrics used in the Black Ridge pitch deck. Next came the payment ledgers, routing exorbitant, fraudulent brokerage fees directly to Bell Transit Advisory. And finally, I said, locking eyes with the senior risk officer from our primary lending bank, the debt appendix, the one hiding the collateralization of the Memphis, Atlanta, and Chicago shipping hubs, assets my husband pledged behind my back, putting the entire operational stability of North Rail at catastrophic risk just to fund his hostile takeover. The fund's senior legal counsel stood up abruptly, his face dark with fury. He pointed directly at Tessa. Bell Transit Advisory, are you related to the principal managing partner? Tessa opened her mouth, but only a pathetic, choked sob came out. She is his sister, I answered for her. The lawyer slammed his briefcase shut. You hid a massive conflict of interest and an affiliated shell company from the primary financial disclosures. That alone is federal fraud. We are completely done here. Cornered, desperate, and watching his golden parachute burn to ashes. Mason turned on the only person left. He spun around and pointed an accusing finger at Tessa. She orchestrated the vendor contracts, Mason shouted, his voice shrill with panic. She leveraged her administrative access. I trusted her to vet the logistics partners, and she manipulated the accounts to funnel money to her brother. I had no idea. Tessa stared at him, her eyes wide with absolute betrayal. The man she thought was going to give her a corporate kingdom was tossing her directly under the wheels of the train to save his own skin. "You lying coward!" Tessa shrieked, her aristocratic facade completely gone. She pulled her mobile phone from her pocket, her hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped it. "I have every single text message you ordered me to set up the accounts. You are the one who hired the private investigators to follow her. You sat in my bed and laughed while you drafted the fake psychological reports to prove she was insane." The two of them began to viciously tear each other apart, screaming accusations and exposing every dirty criminal detail of their conspiracy right in front of the board of directors, the furious bankers, and the disgusted private equity partners. They were two rats trapped in a burning cage, biting each other's throats. Walter Quinn slammed his cane against the floor, silencing the room. "The board will come to order immediately," Walter commanded. The remaining board members hastily took their seats, looking terrified. "I call for an emergency. Immediate vote. I move to terminate Mason Whitaker for extreme catastrophic cause, effectively instantly. I move to terminate Tessa Bell. I move to freeze all executive compensation, stock options, and severance packages associated with both individuals, and to hand every piece of evidence presented today directly to the federal authorities for criminal investigation and civil litigation." The vote was unanimous. It took less than 30 seconds. Security guards, who had been waiting quietly in the outer corridor on my orders, stepped into the room. They stripped Mason of his corporate access badge and escorted a sobbing, hysterical Tessa toward the freight elevators. Mason did not look at me as he was led away. There was nothing left in his eyes but the hollow, terrifying realization that he had lost absolutely everything. The investors hastily packed their briefcases and fled the room, desperate to distance themselves from the toxic fallout. When the boardroom finally emptied, leaving only Naomi, Walter, my aunt, and me, I did not collapse into a chair. I did not shed a single tear for the death of my marriage. I walked out of the suite and took the elevator down to the main atrium, where hundreds of employees had gathered, buzzing with the chaotic rumors of the police arriving at the building. I stood on the landing of the grand staircase and looked out over the sea of faces. The fear and uncertainty in their eyes mirrored the exhaustion I had felt for 2 long years. "Northrail Cold Freight will not be sold today," I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the vast atrium without the need for a microphone. "We will not be stripped for parts by fraudulent executives, and we will not be led by fear. Effective immediately, I am resuming full executive control as chairwoman of Northrail Cold Freight. The previous management team is gone. We are instituting a comprehensive, independent audit of all operational accounts, and we are bringing back the veteran directors who were wrongfully forced out." A stunned silence held the room for a moment, and then a slow, rolling wave of applause began to break across the crowd, growing louder and more confident with every passing second. I stood there and felt the heavy, suffocating weight finally lift from my chest. I understood a bitter, yet incredibly beautiful truth in that exact moment. On the day I stood in that cafeteria and drank from that brushed steel water bottle, I did not lose a husband worth keeping. A man willing to steal my legacy and question my sanity had never truly been mine. What I gained that day was my life back. I reclaimed my name. I rescued the empire my mother built with her bare hands, and I took total, absolute control of the future they had tried so desperately to pawn behind my back. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.